Nancy, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. You have so many years of experience in pharmacoepidemiology and real-world evidence, and I know that you've worked across areas that range as wide as COVID research to working with the National Football League and Major League Baseball, as well as experience in the US with EMA and China. If you were to sum up where you think the field of real world evidence is today, what do you think are the top issues that we as researchers should be or are grappling with?
Well, just to set the record straight, was the National Basketball Association. Haven't cracked with Major League Baseball yet, but thank you for the lovely introduction, Patty. You know, the thing that's top of mind for every researcher who wants to use real world evidence or who wants to, or a biopharmaceutical company or medical device manufacturer who wants to submit real world data for regulator decision making or for payers, everybody wants to know, how can you trust the quality of the data? So that's where we start. I think the three things you need to remember are transparency, provenance, and curation. So transparency, everybody needs to see, will want to see what you've done. You can't hide what you're doing. You don't have to name, for example, if you're using insurance claims, you don't have to say, I got them from the ABC insurer, but you have to talk about the regionality or something. So the provenance of the data is a term that's come into recent use. Mm-hmm. And it really talks about the history of those data, where they came from, why they were created. For example, I remember trying to once study psychiatric events and health insurance claims. And that's where I got my first lesson about mental health carve-outs. They're often provided by a different insurer. So if I use the main insurance data, I won't see a single psychiatric event, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't covered. So understanding why somebody is in a database, how long they're in the database, what events you like to see, those are all things we talk about in provenance. And then curation is very important. That's how you check the data, how you edit it, how you create new variables. What do you do to make sure that what you asked for is exactly what you got? A huge important step. It's really easy to make small mistakes in transferring large data, which introduces a systematic error. So now we've talked about provenance, curation, transparency, but the biggest issue, I think, is relevance. And that's where you need to start. Sometimes we find data that's highly relevant, but imperfect. It's small, or tech oncology. We'd love to know progression-free survival time after a treatment, but in the real-world setting, we don't do biopsies just for the heck of it, so we'll understand the progression. But we who use existing data to study the equivalent of progression-free survival, we look at time to treatment change. Mm-hmm. The thinking is that you don't change your treatment if you're doing well. So is time to treatment change less desirable and more imperfect? Yes. Is it better than nothing? Heck yes. We have a way to start to estimate and to start to put boundaries on safety and effectiveness.
That's so well summarized in terms of the major issues. I'm going to drill just a little bit further down into data provenance, given the fact that it's so much in our foresight right now. Do researchers understand how to describe and evaluate and define data provenance, or is that still being discovered?
That's an interesting question, Patty. What I've heard from customers and from biopharmaceutical companies is that their submissions, when they use real world data, they can describe the provenance of their data in anywhere from a paragraph or two. To one company I heard of, that their provenance description went 50 pages. Mm-hmm. So it depends a lot on whether the database has had publications or not, but there is no prescriptive guidance. And I think we need to rely on common sense. What a skeptic would require. And I always think about replicability or the ability to replicate a study in another population using either the same methods in another population or different methods in the same population. People need to know what you did and who you did it on, and then we can see if that's some quirk of that covered population or it's really a biological fact you'll see over and over again.
Mhm. When you're submitting manuscripts to journals, are you doing something different in terms of what you're providing to enable replicability?
Like, that gets back, yes and no. It gets back to the transparency.
Mhm,
It's always the same trade-off in describing the provenance goes with describing exactly how you've handled the data, how you've analyzed it and the like. Most
mhm,
people don't put out their statistical programs. Despite various journal policies that have come and gone over time, most people don't make their data available because they haven't finished analyzing it or there's more to know or it's not theirs to share for a
mhm.
variety of good reasons. So we get more questions, but we get most of the questions we get are about generalizability and representativeness, not about what you did and how you did it.
Nancy, you mentioned that quality is a key issue in real world evidence and in order to describe reliability and validity. How are you ascertaining the quality of the data and how are regulatory agencies like FDA, EMA, and others evaluating that?
Well, there has been a spate of guidance documents all around the world.
Mhm,
Um, the FDA has put out a series of guidance documents about guidance for industry on submitting real world evidence for decision support for drugs and for medical devices. They have put out guidance for expectations about registries, about electronic healthcare record, EHR, EMR, electronic medical records, health insurance claims. They have so there is a lot of guidance documents coming from the U.S. Most of them are new. Most of them are in draft form. But
mhm,
then you look in Europe, they've had the European Medicines Agency has had a long-standing, equal to the United States in terms of the length of their interest in real-world evidence, lots of guidance documents, lots of clarity, lots of progress, despite seemingly data protection issues that you might think would make it hard to amass large amounts of data that go cross borders. And then we have regulation. Japan's issued regulation on registries, and they have a series of guidance documents coming out, not just about how do you evaluate quality, but who's responsible for which parts of the quality. Their
mm,
documents talk about the vendor should do this, if you take that word vendor, but the data supplier should do this much, and then the user should do this, this, and this. So very, very thoughtful. And then China is not one to be left behind either. Their National Medical Products Agency, the shorthand NMPA, has issued a variety of guidance documents on their expectations. For example, I think they're the first regulatory agency in the world who talks about pragmatic trials specifically
mhm,
not requiring blinding. That's a
mhm,
big game changer. But
mhm,
if I can go on for a minute about China, Patty, they have got some very interesting experiments using, or trials is a better way of saying it, not a randomized trial, but attempts to harness the power of real world data. For example, there's the Hainan Boao pilot zone, which most people outside of China probably haven't heard of. It's a large island with a comprehensive electronic medical record for everybody in the island.
mm,
And they have set up pilot zones where they allow use of medicines and medical devices approved outside of China for the purpose of being able to study how they work in ethnic Chinese. And they've set up a rapid regulatory review cycle. So, for example, a recent brag point, well deserved, was for an anti-cancer product. This was for metastatic thyroid cancer. It was approved for use in China within 6 months of the first time it was allowed to be used in Boao. So, very fast way of evaluating the generalizability of data created outside of Japan.
Hmm.
Sorry, outside of China. They've also now expanded this to what they call the Greater Bay Area. And the Bay they're talking about is Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen, and Guangdong. And the idea is that products get approved sooner, I would say, in Macau and Hong Kong. They've established a collaboration between hospitals on the mainland China side in Guangdong and Shenzhen to also use these products and to start to amass sizable amounts of information to figure out how well these products work in ethnic Chinese. Very exciting, I think.
That is exciting and absolutely fascinating. What can the US and Europe learn from that, and how could they take that approach and apply it in our countries?
Well, you have to have a solution that fits your country's needs.
Mhm.
Mainland China has a lot of I don't want to talk about the ethnicity of all the Chinese because I know it's complex and I don't want to oversimplify it. But I
Mhm.
think we're seeing massive efforts in Europe, for example, with Darwin, which is a new network that is an absolute game changer. So
Mhm.
this is existing data from many countries, many locales. The data don't have to leave the country. It's a federated network, much like our Sentinel system. But
Mhm.
this one has oversight from and control by the European Medicines Agency. So they have a hand in everything. And they are building this as a prototype for supporting quick and efficient analytics, so data assembly and analytics to evaluate medication safety. And this is, they say, is the first step of something called the European Health Data Space, which is their larger vision for an even broader set of data. And this
Mhm.
will allow them, imagine they can take the data from Spain, from France, from the Netherlands, from many places and put it together, but also then look in the subgroups in each country so they can make much broader conclusions confidently and quickly.
And what stage is Darwin in?
Darwin is up and running.
Mhm.
I followed this since IQVIA is helping organize it and do some of the technical support. But it's recently up and running, and the European Medicines Agency is proud of it. And you'll be hearing Peter Arlett, among others, give webinars about it.
Yeah, I just signed up for that webinar, so I'm looking forward to it. So, Nancy, you had significant experience in COVID related real world research in your time at IQVIA, and where you hold the title of Chief Scientific Officer Emerita. What learnings came from that work that you initiated there that help us better understand how patients can play a greater role in real world evidence research?
Well, I'd like to answer that question in terms of both patients and health systems. Let me
Okay.
just start talking about the state of Israel and this very interesting collaboration they had with Pfizer. In his book Moonshot, Pfizer's president Albert Bourla, says it's the greatest scientific tool the world has had for studying COVID and vaccines. But he's got the proof points. So they used a very large national health record system to study the vaccines as they entered the marketplace, and they traced the variants of COVID as they came, so they could not just say this is safe and effective against the Delta variant, but they can evaluate each variant as it came along. It was a living laboratory, and they say that in the first 100 days of the pandemic, this rapid information cycle both was useful in encouraging a or resulted in a high vaccination rate in Israel. And they calculate in the first 100 days, they saved close to 6,000 lives. That's
Mm.
close to 6,000 deaths prevented by this information. I think that's pretty cool. But that's a health record story, and that's a an evidence hub story where we've used real world evidence and brought in external data about the variants and introduce new treatments. But I had the fun and the scientific excitement of doing direct to patient type of research on COVID. So these weren't patients, so I like to call it person generated health data or community based research. But when the pandemic hit, as you know, there were lots of big trials, there were lots of studies about hospitalizations, but we were wondering, what about everybody else who isn't in the hospital? And
Mhm.
why are some people getting very sick and some people seem to be exposed to COVID and they barely have a sniffle? Uh,
Mhm.
you know, I wondered, was it maybe it was a vitamin they're taking?
Mhm.
Maybe it was something that we don't know about that doesn't readily appear in a health record. So
Mhm.
we launched a a community-based research program where we built a registry of about 33,000 people who contributed information about their COVID exposures, the testing, whether or not they got vaccinated, any positive tests after vaccine, the reactions to the vaccine. So I think the power of this kind of information is using our communities and our neighbors to tell each other this was my experience. So, I wasn't very sick or I was sick for a day. And that big hope, since I'm sure you're wondering about this, but that big hope, was it, vitamin D? No, it
Mhm.
wasn't. We weren't able to find yet. I don't think the 33,000 or our follow-up was long enough to really figure out that secret sauce. And maybe we just weren't collecting the right data. But we're starting to appreciate how much we can learn from community reporters without the interface of a clinician, which was so important during the pandemic when all our healthcare workers were just exhausted from working round the clock. And the question is, how could we not further burden them? Now, you can't do everything directly to patients. You often want clinical validation, but it's usually of selected events. And sometimes you can get it from an electronic medical record with the patient's help. So I think we're going to see a whole lot more of this type of research.
Mhm. And so in your projects that you're working on now, have you changed how you are bringing in this community-based information? Is there something that you might have previously not included that perspective, but based on your experience with COVID, you are more of an advocate of that?
Well, I based this COVID research on work that I had done in collaboration with the European Medicines Agency a dozen years ago.
Mm.
So they were interested in, could you study um, the risks of medications taken in the first trimester of pregnancy? Because that's something that's very hard to study from existing records because women don't generally come in to see their OB in the first trimester of pregnancy. What I learned from that is we asked too many questions and
Mhm.
people dropped out, especially when it's just a volunteer basis. What I learned from the COVID research is we still ask too many questions. And I
Mm.
also learned that um, community reporters are getting very sophisticated. It
Mm.
was an interesting transition during the pandemic. In the beginning, you could put advertisements on the internet through social media and get lots and lots of volunteers. And as we got more sophisticated in our research questions, we could be very specific. Have you tested positive in the last 7 days? Was this your first COVID episode? All those kinds of questions. But as the epidemic progressed, people were realizing that their information was valuable. And this
Mhm.
is my same experience with EMA a dozen years ago when we went and tried to do focus groups and, among people who didn't participate, what would it take? Everyone said, I would do it for the good of mankind. But if you gave me a little consideration, I'd do it. I really do it because they say you pay clinicians, you pay your healthcare professionals. How about recognizing the value of what I give you?
Mhm.
So I did do one small community-based study where we paid a very modest reimbursement for follow-up, and I think I got 4 or 5 times more follow-up higher follow-up rates with a small inducement. So it's a more sophisticated market. But the big excitement, Patty, I think, is in digital health technologies. That's the new rage, and I would love to have the opportunity to study some of these passive monitors, these wearables that measure, that use actigraphy to create endpoints based on movement, even very fine movement patterns. And they're doing some very exciting work now where in Parkinson's, for example, if you haven't heard of the study Watch PD, they use an Apple Watch to starting to develop markers of early impairment, even among people who haven't been diagnosed with Parkinson's yet. So imagine, on the one hand, the fright of knowing that you have this early impairment, or maybe the reassurance of knowing that you don't, despite your fears. But if
Hmm.
you do have that, it gives patients the choice of how they want to spend their time and what they want to do. And it gives them some measurement of trajectory. So it's a big deal.
Hmm. That is such an exciting it's such an exciting progress that is happening in the area. And it makes me wonder if patients, as you say, are starting to better understand the value of what they have to offer. I think in general, community members through the internet and all of the advertising that happens, that they understand that they are the source of the income for these larger companies, and recognize that their existence can be monetarily recognized.
And this
And
isn't
so,
this isn't going to be like selling blood, where you can, you can do this frequently. It'll keep you off the streets and stuff. These are generally modest reimbursements, unless you come in and donate biologic samples and the like. So just on
mhm.
perspective.
So there's a lot of conversation around diversity inclusion in clinical trials, and as well as in secondary data sources. How much of a concern is this from a drug approval and post-approval real-world evidence standpoint?
Oh boy, that's the big question on everybody's mind.
Mhm.
It's a dilemma. It's an important issue. We know that there are ethnic differences in responses to treatments. We know that even within ethnicities there are differential responses, and we don't exactly know why. And
Mhm.
maybe more important, the idea, well, let's start with what the RCT is. A randomized controlled trial, as we have them now, or a randomized clinical trial, has very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. The concept is find people who are almost exactly identical, except they'll be randomly assigned to a treatment. So it's a beautiful experiment because there is so little variation other than the treatment between the groups. We like that. Now imagine now you have the issue. So that's how you get studies of white males, age 30 to 32 kind of thing, which won't apply to you and me and lots of other people. And the advantage of participating in clinical trials is huge. It gives you early access to treatments that may be life saving. And it also gives you access to fabulous clinical care because in that RCT framework, you want to have the best clinicians who really know how to administer the treatment or implant the medical device. You want to be in the best clinical setting so that there's no extraneous explanations for why something may fail or succeed. Um, so it's some people look at clinical trial participation as a pathway to care. So you
Mhm.
don't want to hold that back from people. But then the drawback, now we've taken this beautiful experiment and say, let's open it up to all comers. Then it gets really blurry because you've got different gender, different ethnicity, different age. You don't want to do that. Or if you want to make a meaningful trial with a lot of diversity, you make it much bigger so that you can have meaningfully sized subgroups.
Mhm.
All that makes good sense, except that bigger trials take longer to complete. They take longer to start up, they take longer to finish. And it's not the question of the pharmaceutical companies not leaning hard enough on the partner who's helping them connect it or not leading hard enough on something or not paying enough. It's the mechanics of recruiting 300 people or 30,000 people. It's different. So if we make our CTs bigger and more diverse but meaningful, we're going to actually slow drug approvals. So then
Mhm.
we have the conundrum that you want early access to new life saving treatments, but you want them to be safe and effective. But you don't want the regulators to build such a large, convincing evidence base beforehand that you wait another 10 years for access.
Mhm.
So I personally think that the balance has to be um, either a complementary real world evidence, because of course I'm a supporter of that, and then I think there are interesting opportunities for unique experiments along the lines of what we're seeing in China in that Hainan Wow
Mhm.
pilot zone, or in these areas where you can broaden testing, but you do it within a health system where you can have very thorough surveillance, including after the trial.
Mhm. And so, with the diversity and inclusion challenge, can you speak a little bit about what some of the processes are that are trying to take that challenge head on? How are researchers really trying to accomplish a more diverse and inclusive trial?
I think the first thing you need to study is the natural history of the condition. I mean, you're most likely going to do a study of sickle cell anemia in an African American population.
Mhm.
Um, but so you need to understand who's getting the disease and who gets really harmed by the condition, because maybe some ages, races, and ethnicities are not as reactive or not as impaired as others. So you need to understand the natural history of the disease, the unmet needs, and that's where you start with real world evidence. So first of all, let's get the lay of the world and understand who's at most risk, because those are the people that we want to study. And then I do think the solution is separate trials in focused and targeted. So rather than trying to blur or do one big trial, you can choose either a variety of sites located in areas where the ethnicities of interest reside,
Mhm.
or also you're going to I think there's going to be more use of some of these single arm trials where you get your reference or your context from real world evidence. So then you can build out a bigger story. Okay, I have a small population of people with these characteristics in my trial. When I mirror them, I could make a digital twin, or when
Mm.
I mirror them otherwise in a much larger population, this is what I see happening to them, and based on the small evidence in the trial, their trajectory is different. So I think there are a number of ways we can strengthen the evidence and augment it by using real world evidence in addition to the classical trials.
Could you give a brief explanation of what a digital twin is?
So a digital twin is somebody almost like me, somebody nearly just like me. They're doing this a lot in genomics, or they're starting to do it. It's a new technique, but we have some wonderful registries with a lot of genetic information, and you can test your patient, your person, find out their makeup, and then look for other people like them who have this unique information in a larger data set. That's essentially it, is my understanding.
If you were to advise an EMR company, are there demographic and other clinical fields that you wish were a standard outcome measure that we would say, if you're going to do three things, would you add this to your process of collecting data?
That's I don't even know the amount of dollars to put behind how much the high value of that question that you've asked. It's not easy to what we're seeing is customized EMR customized to a therapeutic area. So
Mhm.
some people specialize in rheumatoid arthritis or oncology, and they ask a lot of questions or collect data that's highly relevant to that condition,
Mhm.
which makes sense, but I don't quite understand the full implications of the implementation, and that's not my area of expertise. But the um, I'm so enamored or fascinated by outcomes that measuring outcomes that matter to people and simplifying some of the processes we use. You know, if I could go back to those digital health technologies for a sec, Patty, one of the other, I talked about using an Apple Watch to measure early impairment. There's another wearable that measures nocturnal itch. Now, if you don't have severe dermatitis or severe atopic dermatitis or any type of nocturnal itch, you probably won't think that's important. But if you do, you'll know this drives people crazy.
Mhm.
It ruins their sleep. It's just awful. And now I remember working on a product that was designed for dermatitis or severe dermatitis, and all the clinicians had a 300 points that they measured to understand the spread and the severity. I get it. I get that importance. But there
Mhm.
was one clinician in the audience who raised her hand and said, I can measure severe atopic dermatitis with one question. I ask him if itch keeps them up at night. So I have
Mhm.
that in the back of my brain. And now I see there's a new wearable that can actually measure where you're scratching, how much you're scratching, so it can measure how the spread and the severity of your itch. And this has now been approved as a new endpoint. Think
Mhm.
of the opportunities here to develop endpoints, simpler ways to get at endpoints that really, really make a difference.
Mhm. As long as we can get those individuals into a clinician's office and be able to deliver the product to them. Mhm.
And the product works. But it starts by simplifying a lot for your research program. So how to get
Indeed.
those trials in the right places or otherwise build the evidence to be able to not to have more standardization in patient-generated data. So if,
Mhm.
when we go to the doctor, they say, tell me your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Well,
Mhm.
my 6 is probably not your 6. And,
Mhm.
they watch me over time to see how that changes. So they're always comparing me to me. But
Mhm.
imagine if I wore a watch, that it was actually measured, taking precise, it has an accelerometer in it, or maybe not the watch, but some of these other devices, and they have objective measurements. So I think that's going to be a big advantage.
So, are there any other additional trends that you think are important for us to know that are affecting real world evidence in terms of collection, analysis, and use?
Well, we've talked a little bit about the digital health technologies, and we see a new push from the FDA indicating their interest in these digital health technologies. So that's very exciting. But I think the next big development is record linkage. Now, I'm sure your listeners are saying, what is she talking about? That's not new. But think again. Record linkage on a large scale, um, first of all, relies on people telling the truth or you having identifiers to accurately link people. The
Mhm.
big game changer is that now the FDA has said they are in many ways and in many of these guidance documents that they are encouraging record linkage. So
Mhm.
it adds more information. Take my person generated health data. This is the way you get to validate people's answers. If they said they took a drug, did they? Can we show that they actually filled the prescription and are taking it? Or it gives you a confirmation and a diagnosis. So hugely powerful. But the big game changer is that now the FDA has asked for people who submit linked data as evidence or supporting evidence to show the accuracy of the linkage.
Mhm.
That's a lot harder because we use AI and machine learning tools to find good matches. But like much of AI, it's in a black box. So we don't know exactly how they did it. So most of the linkage systems you have will give you matches, but you don't know if it's a perfect match or how close the match is. You really don't know if you've got exactly the right people.
Mhm.
I don't know, I had a real interesting experience in that study I was telling you about in pregnancy that I did with the European Medicines Agency. One of the countries that participated was Denmark. Now, Denmark has a national prescription registry.
Mhm.
So we asked women, are they taking any prescription meds? What are they? It was a little hard to separate sometimes non-prescription and prescription meds, but our agreement with the National Prescription Registry and people self-reporting was around 83%. Like, why wasn't it 100%?
Mhm.
We learned that sometimes meds for pain or for migraine were old prescriptions, and we only look back 6 months from the start of pregnancy. So maybe that was, but to be off by not be higher was a surprise.
Mhm.
And then in this study we did with IQVIA called CARE, the COVID active research experience, we also asked people for permission to link their data, and we, with their permission, had their only for linkage purposes and kept very private their key personal identifiers that would support linkage. And we asked them if they took prescription meds and what meds they took. And for those people who said they were taking prescription meds, we didn't have 100% of the prescription meds in the United States, but we had a lot. And
Mhm.
our match rate was in maybe 70%.
Mhm.
And why wasn't that higher? Uh,
Mhm.
it's it's not clear. So you don't know if it's missing data or because we don't have a 100% comprehensive system, even though Denmark did,
Mhm.
or something else that I don't know yet.
So I'm always interested in unintended consequences. So with the FDA having some emphasis on record linkage, is there any risk of an unintended consequence that a standalone health-related quality of life evaluation that is not record linked to some other data source might be diminished in importance from a regulatory perspective? Something that's, previously provided and enhanced our understanding of a disease. But now the FDA might say, well, that standalone questionnaire must be linked to something else to help validate it.
Well, conceptual, I'm thinking about the unintended consequences. I know that the promise people first thing many epidemiologists and others would think about is, oh, we'll get long-term follow-up, right? I took this med, I think I'm okay, but it will be useful for everybody to understand that. But many people don't realize that the average membership in a health plan in the United States overall is what, 2.5, 3 years? Not because you die, but if you're employed, you change jobs, or your employer changes insurance coverage. And for the 19 to 29-year-olds who are the most mobile, they have the even shorter durations. So the unintended consequences could be assuming that somebody's well because you don't see any claims when they're not coming anymore.
Mhm.
So you always worry about missing data and what does it mean, and you never ever have enough. Maybe that was too strong. You rarely have enough ways to get fully complete data, or if you do, it's on such a small subpopulation, they're really different from everybody.
Mhm.
So um, we need to think carefully. I think my concern or my guess is that some of the things that may come to light as we start to go through, particularly electronic health records, is the notes may not be as informative as we thought.
Mhm.
Leave it at that.
Mhm. Let's move to some rapid fire questions. What is the best example that you can come up with where real world evidence has been used to improve patient outcomes?
Well, I'm torn. I mean, the first thing I think of is safety registries, and like we learned about the metal on metal hips were dangerous. So those are huge medical device registries. And I think of the TAVR, the transaortic valve research, where we learned about different ways that valves could be successfully implanted beyond what it was first labeled. And that's led to labeling changes. And I think of disease registries like cystic fibrosis, which have been used to provide context for new meds. So I see tremendous promise in disease and condition registries as well as device registries for their follow up and for their ability to rapidly augment information from the date of first market authorization.
Let me pick up a little bit on the medical device industry. We oftentimes don't delve into either the similarities or the differences in medical device versus biopharma. Is there anything different in medical device real world evidence research that you'd like to talk about?
Well, medical device research had a huge boost recently due to a very hard-fought, successful campaign to develop unique medical device identifiers.
Mm,
So you can't really study something if you don't know what it was. If I have a hearing aid, you need to know what the brand is. If I have a hip implant, you need to know exactly what each part was.
mhm,
So creating those uniform identifiers were the first, unique identifiers, and the system for that was the first step. But then getting it into records was much harder because you had asked me before about what could EMR makers add. Every data element turns out to be hugely costly, and it's not. You need to get it in, make sure you record it correctly, and store it. And I'm told it's very costly.
mhm,
So you worry about the good development was being able to understand what the device was and to have long-term follow-up. But as
mhm,
you know, and many of your listeners might know, medical devices are approved often when in small changes to a predicate device, so an older device. And you take a complex thing like a hip, there are lots of predicate devices that go into it that necessarily haven't been that well studied. And a small change to something that you didn't really know how well the older thing worked is
mhm,
hard. So it's really difficult, and because it's a device, it's difficult to study. The unique identifiers help, but also the medical device cycle is much more rapid than the drug cycle. So drugs get tweaked when its patents running out,
right,
uh, but medical devices, as soon as they get tweaked regularly. So last year's device, even though it has the same name, may be different from this year's, or maybe it has a slightly different model number, but it's very, very complex. And we have developed a medical device surveillance system. I was privileged to be part of that planning committee. It's been a long time coming, but it's here, and it's what we need.
mhm. Is it fair to say that medical device real world evidence research is messier than biopharmaceutical real world evidence because of that?
I would think so. I think you could go that far. I mean, when
Mhm,
we take a drug, we have a very thorough national drug dictionary that we all use, and we have an elegant, clearly defined coding system, and things don't change that much.
mhm,
As we get into more personalized medicine, the drugs will be harder to study because, how did you do that CAR T therapy? I know you harvested the cells, and we followed a very prescribed method for doing what needs to be done to make an effective targeted treatment. But because it is so personalized, I wonder about the challenges of generalization from
mhm,
small amounts of data. Not,
mhm, mhm.
but on the other hand, they're making huge impacts, so I don't want to slow them down.
What is one thing that pharma needs to do better to maximize real world evidence utility?
I think pharma would benefit from much more patient input. We learn from the RCT if treatments can work, not if they really do work in real life settings or everyday settings. And people sometimes hear that and scratch their head and go, "What's the difference?" Well, big difference.
Mhm.
Um, but the questions that I think should be continue to get more attention in the biopharmaceutical industry and by regulators is really the impact on patients' lives. For example, does a certain treatment allow me to get out of bed and take care of myself? Hugely important. My ability to live independently or to function. So I think some of the this isn't my specialty, so but it's my impression that they could use a lot more input from patients on if they take a treatment, what is their experience, and if they stop taking it, why?
Mhm.
Was it financial? Was it tolerability? There are a lot you can learn from patients that I'm not sure you always get, or they may be reluctant to share with the healthcare provider.
Mhm, mhm. Or it may not be, widely shared with the clinical audience. It may be just, individual knowledge that a company has, but it's not shared in a universal
Right,
fashion.
or it may be dismissed by the clinician as not as important as the fact that your count of this, that, or the other is reversing. And
Mhm,
it is a dialogue and it's a complex system. But I think the patient we talk about patient centricity, but hearing the patient voice,
mhm.
I think sometimes we're not as keenly attuned to that as we could be.
I know that you spend part of your time in the educational system and have a strong interest in training new individuals to work in this field. What should our graduate and medical pharmacy nursing schools teach more of to enable researchers and clinicians to be better managers of these real world data insights?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that because I think that it would help to learn about real world evidence and, of course, specifically epidemiology, because I think teaches you critical thinking.
Mhm,
Right now, our most physicians have learned in medical school about randomized clinical trials, and they view that as the gold standard with some good reason, no argument. But they like simple scales. Here's a grade of evidence. This is on the top, this isn't, so that what isn't must be bad. They need to understand the value of what they can learn from natural experiments, from natural history studies, and where they should be questioning those and what they should be wondering. So,
mhm,
now everyone says, well, it's not representative. And that it just grates at me because I don't want everything to be representative of everybody. I want to know about specific characteristics. I want to build the evidence base so that I can tell you about here's how new immigrants from the Asian countries react to such and such a product. Here's how different ethnicities, different age, different gender react or benefit or don't. I want all those points. I don't want them mushed into one average treatment effect. I
mhm,
want those
mhm.
specific treatment effects for the different parts of the population that we're interested in. And you need to train people to understand why, if you can only study a certain community, why that evidence may be valuable in itself.
Mhm. This is a little bit of a tangent, but as you were talking about that, do we underrepresent the nurse's view of being a communicators of the patient's perspective? We often talk about the clinician, meaning typically the medical physician provider. But I'm just wondering, given the extraordinarily important and bedside role of nurses in our healthcare delivery, if we don't delve in enough to what they can offer us on our understanding of disease and treatments and patients.
That's an interesting question. And I think we have to broaden it. It's not just nurses. It's now we have nurse practitioners, we have physician assistants, and
Mhm,
many of them are extremely knowledgeable. And
mhm,
if I could say, more patient than some of the clinicians. You
Mhm.
take a busy surgeon, they want to be in the OR doing their thing. You talk to their PA, you can often get very thoughtful answers about the things that are troubling you as a patient, and it goes a long way to increasing confidence, to reducing anxiety, and I think to better outcomes. So I
Mhm.
think there is an extremely valuable role for these non-physician caregivers, but I'm not sure I have the system for doing that.
So, Nancy, what are you most excited about as you look forward in healthcare that no one else is talking about or that should be talked about more in depth?
Well, I'm I pay a lot of attention to what people are talking about in new developments, so I don't know what people aren't talking about, but I'm very excited about the digital health technologies and the advances that offers us. And I'm also really excited about record linkage. I mean, even in the United States, we
Mhm.
have a relatively new law that gives patients the ability to download their medical records, their electronic health records, for their own use or for research use. And as we start to really build up the infrastructures to support that, because you can't use it for finding events you don't know that happened, but it's a great source of validation. So I'm excited about direct to patient research, community based research as an addition to contributing evidence to our currently used sources, whether it's a randomized controlled trial or other clinical studies. I think there's a lot to learn, but that record linkage just gives you so much more information and so much more assurance about the accuracy and the validity of the information you're getting, that I think this is a transformation in how we generate evidence about medical product safety and effectiveness. And we see that regulators agree. Now we just need to get the medical community on board, and the biopharmaceutical company, I think, are the most conservative. They
Mhm.
are the slowest to change because their people say, "Hey, this worked before, it'll work again. I don't want to risk
Mhm.
this drug we've spent so much investment in on a study method that won't be approved by regulators." But the change is happening now, so we need to bring them on board too.
Well, Nancy, I want to thank you. Your knowledge, your breadth of awareness of what's going on around the globe, and your enthusiasm for the type of research you do and the importance of patients in the way that we treat and manage disease really comes through. And it's always such a pleasure to speak with you. I learn a lot, and I always just really enjoy the opportunity to dialogue with you. Thank you.
As do I with you, Patty. You've made tremendous contributions to the industry and to knowledge over time, and thank you.
They're minuscule compared to what you've done, but thank you for that.